Welcome to Halacha in a Year, where we can get to learn all the most relevant halacha through the prism of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. You are listening to Rabbi Ya'akov Trump. This year is kindly sponsored by the Moshe Group and CA in zechus of Béla, bas נחמה Shiphra, and in honor of Rabbi Trump. We now continue the halachas of washing hands before the meal. This is the second section. This is Perek Mem, the 40th chapter, Siman Mem in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We're going to look at a few basic concepts over here. 5 concepts that we'll be looking at. The first is chatzitza, interruptions that are on the hands, which could create a problem for the Netzilas Yadayim. Number 2 is koach gavra, is that using one's own strength to wash. Number 3 is what one does if there's no water. Number 4 is what happens if there are interruptions. And number 5 is foods which are dipped in liquid. Let's jump straight in. First is chatzitza, interruptions. This actually follows a lot of the halachas which are similar to the halachas of going to a mikveh. The background is one is not supposed to have any interruptions, anything which is stopping the water from reaching the entire hand when doing Netzilas Yadayim. A few basic questions. Number 1 is, do long nails matter? The answer is no, nails are part of the hand. However, one needs to be careful that there's no dirt under the long nails, because the dirt would be an interruption, and the longer the nails there are, the more one is makbid, and the more one does not notice that there is dirt underneath the hands as well. Also, if one has a nail which is hanging, then one would want to get rid of that, and that would be considered a chatzitza and a bit of a problem as well. What about rings? Rings need to be removed before washing. What happens if they're loose? The water's going to get there. They still need to be removed, because sometimes it could be that there is a certain section of the hand which is not going to be covered by water. What happens if they cannot be removed? They just haven't been removed for years. They just cannot get off. The fingers are not as slim as they used to be. I just never take them off. So if a person is never taking off their rings, not even for showering or for kneading dough, that's the activity the Gemara uses, then in that case, then one would be able to wash with them. But if there's any time that a person would ever take off their rings, then they would need to take them off for Netzilas Yadayim as well. In the case that one never takes them off, one cannot get them off, then in that case one can wash with them, and one would rotate that ring after the water is there, so to making sure that it is actually is enabled, that there is water reaching under there as much as possible. What happens if I have a color on my hands? Let's say I have there's ink on my hands or a henna. What would one do in that case? Does that preclude me from washing my hands for Netzilas Yadayim? So the answer is not really, because there are 2 conditions that one of which, either or conditions which are necessary for there to be a chatzitza or a problem. One is it needs to be a rubai, it needs to be most of the hand, even though I don't really care about it. Or if it's a miut, even if it's a little bit of the hand, and a makbid, I want to get rid of that, I'm going to take it off, then either of those situations are going to be problematic. And of course, if it's a ruba hamakbid, if it's most of the hand and I want to get it off, obviously that's a problem. But this only situation would be when, let's say you have something which is a miut, which is a minority of the hand, and I'm not makbid about it as well. So in this case, one wants the henna, one wants the ink pattern on one's hand, it doesn't have substance, and therefore, in this case, it would not be considered a problem. What about a bandage? So it depends. If it is the type of bandage which is on there and is meant to be there for a number of weeks, and it is painful, it would pull off scabs and it would be very painful to remove, in that situation, one does not need to remove it. However, one would need to ensure, so let's say it's on one's pinky, one would need to lift up one's pinky and pretend as if that pinky doesn't exist. So one would need to wash the rest of one's hands without the pinky being covered with water, because if the water goes onto that bandage, it will be absorbed in the bandage and it's tamei water, because it is not at that point in time clean fully, and therefore that water is going to create a problem. So one needs to either cover it or lift it up in such a way that every other part of the hand is washed except for that section. However, if it's the type of bandage that one replaces every few hours or every day, and it's just a scratch, in that case, one would need to remove it for Netzilas Yadayim. That would not be an excuse to leave it on in that situation as well. Let's go into our next concept. The next concept is what's called koach gavra. The idea is that netila, it means to say that one is actually pouring the water. If one's pouring the water, it needs to be a human being doing this. It cannot be that the water is falling without human intervention. So a few basic quick questions and answers, 3 in this section. What about a tap? Can I switch on the tap? The answer is, well, the regular tap or faucet is a problem because it has no clear, it has no vessel, there's only pipes connecting it to the reservoir. That would not be suffice. Okay, so let's be a little more smart. What happens if there's a tap on a barrel? So the tap is on a barrel, which is considered a kli. Can I open that up? Is opening up a tap considered koach gavra, like pouring it over my hands? The answer is only the first water that comes out, the koach rishon, which means, let's say I have a barrel, I would be able to open it up, put my one hand underneath it, close it. Open it up and put my hand again and close it. And one have to do that for each of those times, because that would be the koach gavra, the intervention in this case as well. This obviously is not true when it comes to a spring, when one's putting one's hand into a spring when there's no koach gavra, but that's because it's attached to the ground. But if one is doing it tilas yadayim, there needs to be a element of human action over here. When is this ever relevant to us? The answer is very simple situation. On an airplane or a train. An airplane or a train have large reservoirs or containers of water. That is a kli. And let's say one is in the restroom and there's no available cups. One doesn't have any bottles or cups available. One can't go to the train car or get one. Now that's, oftentimes one can, but let's say that's not a possibility. One would be able to switch on and off the taps, and then one has a kli because there's the container of water on the train or the airplane, and the opening of the tap, the koach rishon would be the first part one would be able to use, and then switch it off as well. Let's move on to our next concept. What happens if there is no water? There's three basic questions here. If there's no water around, what should one do? So it depends. The halacha that relates to this is a halacha which we've seen in other areas, like washing before davening, and also finding a minyan as well we talked about. And that is that if one is driving along the road, and right now where one is, there is no water to be able to wash, one would need to continue 4 meal in the direction that one is traveling, or 1 meal out of the direction one's traveling. So even if one's in one's own house, that's considered, and one is settled down for the day, moving out of the house is considered the 1 meal radius from the house as well. Is that in time or distance? So the Bir Halacha Chavetz Chaim points out, if one is walking, it would be distance. So a mil is about 1 kilometer. So therefore, let's say one is one's house, one would have to walk 1 kilometer to find water to do netilas yadayim before the meal. But if one's driving, it would be in time. 1 meal is about 18 minutes of driving. So that would be the 1 meal rule in that particular case. If there's no water, even within that distance, hard to imagine today in civilized society, but let's imagine there is no water in that distance, and one's, let's say, traveling, and one is scared to leave one's caravan or the group one's traveling with because of the area that one is in. What should one do in that circumstance? Which again is very hard to imagine. One would be able to wear gloves or wrap one's hand in a cloth and eat. Notice, by the way, how severe this is taken. The Bir Halacha suggests that it's best to avoid eating hamotzi in such situations unless one is very weak. And so they're meaning there are other things to eat. Eat those other things and don't have hamotzi if one cannot wash. This is how severe Halacha takes this as well. Let's look into the next concept. The next concept is the idea of interruptions. So what could cause me to need to wash my hands again, even if I already washed at the beginning of the meal? So the answer is the regular things we've seen before in the other halachos of netilas yadayim when we started learning this. Number one is scratching one's scalp in an area that's usually covered. Another is touching covered parts of the body, so when putting one's hand underneath one's arm under the shirt. Or when one uses the restroom, one would need to wash as well. Would there be a bracha on that? The answer is no. The Kitzur adds in that if one soiled one's hands with excrement, then there may be a need for a bracha. Does one need a full netilah, like one does at the beginning of the meal? The answer is no. 1 wash per hand is sufficient. What if I needed the bathroom before I started eating? How should I wash? So here we have a problem, because on the one hand, you need to wash because you left the bathroom and I say asher yatzar. But you also need to wash and then say netilas yadayim. So if you do one washing, then it's a problem as to which bracha goes first. Because if you do the one washing and say al netilas yadayim, you're disconnecting the asher yatzar from the washing from the bathroom. If you say asher yatzar before, and then you've interrupted between the washing and the bracha of netilas yadayim. So in this case, it's best to wash twice. Wash one time with less water, which is necessary for the asher yatzar, say asher yatzar, then dry off, and then go into the second washing, which is done with a cup and 2 on each hand at least, and then the al netilas yadayim. That would be the way one would need to prepare for that meal in such a case. We're going to look at one last concept. This is a concept which most people are not aware of, but it is in Shulchan Aruch and it's in the Kitzur, and that is foods which are dipped in liquid. There are 7 liquids which are considered machshirim, conductors for impurity. And if one touches a food which is commonly dipped in a liquid and it is still wet, one needs to wash one's hands before one eats that food, that particular food. So a few basic questions. What does that mean? So what if the area of that fruit is not wet that I'm touching right now? So the answer is it doesn't really matter. If the fruit is wet, had been wet, even if this particular area is not wet, that is a problem and I would need to wash my hands. Well, is there a bracha on this washing? The answer is not for this. There's no gzera to make a bracha. Do we do this today? So many are makil, but the Kitzur says that a Yirei Shamayim should be machmir. A person who's fears heaven should wash their hands for something which is food which has been touched one of the 7 liquids. So wait a second. What are those 7 liquids? So their acronym is Yad Shachat Dam, which is wine vinegar, bee honey, olive oil, milk, animal blood, and water. Those are the 7 liquids. So if a food comes into contact with any of these 7 liquids, it is considered mukhshar for tumar. It is ready to receive tumar, and one would need to wash one's hand before eating or touching it directly. What about fruit juice? Let's say that the food has touched fruit juice. That is not one of the 7 liquids and is not a problem. Meaning fruit juice from the fruit, not fruit juice from the bottle, which is usually a concentrate from water with water base. What about fruits preserved in sugar? So if sugar is not considered one of the 7, so that's not an issue. What about butter? So if it's solid, it's not an issue. If it's melted, it is one of the 7 liquids because it really comes from milk. What if I'm using a spoon or a fork? Very important. So the Kitzur says, if it's something that I would never use my hands for, then in that case, one does not need netila. But if it's something I can use my hands for, but in this case I'm not, it would still require washing hands for as well. What about dipping in soaps? This is a salt. This is a problem, says the Kitzur, because salt is produced from water. It's considered like water even in a solid state. The Mishnah Berurah says no, only if the salt is still wet. What about liqueur? That is considered fruit juice and is not one of the 7 liquids, and therefore it's not machshir l'toma. And finally, what about mead? Mead is when you take the dregs of wine and you soak them in water to extract the taste. That is considered like water, and it's one of the 7 mashkim. This is a very, very fascinating halacha. Most people are not aware of this. Most people are makil, even if they are aware of it. However, Yirei Shamayim has opportunity in situations where it is a food which could be eaten with one's hands, and it is wet. One should be careful in this case to do netilas yadayim. Very easy to avoid, very easy to circumvent, but it is a very fascinating application of this halacha. In the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful